David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
You've probably heard it 100 times by now that climate change is a national security threat. And we've talked a little more specifically about the types of national security threat that climate change is. We've talked about it from a military perspective. I've talked about the sort of economic implications, which also make climate change a national security threat. We've talked about the threat of having usable land in our country being an important thing for national security and how climate change can endanger that. It's pretty obvious to any clear-thinking and rational person that climate change threatens our national security in any number of ways, as I often like to say. You can argue about the source of climate change. You can debate, well, what should our policy and response to climate change be? But it is a national security threat, full stop. Donald Trump is going to remove climate change from the list of threats on his national security strategy, which is set to be released today. Maybe by the time you listen to this story or watch it on TV, maybe he has already done that. What will Donald Trump's national security strategy document focus on instead? Border security and economic competitiveness. Legitimate issues, but climate change is still a national security threat. We are a laughingstock. And in producing the show, it gets more and more difficult to react with an actual story and an analysis to this stuff rather than just laughing or maybe crying would be a more reasonable reaction. Look no further than our own military, Donnie boy. Not exactly an organization, the American military, that we can write off as sort of tree-hugging, bleeding heart liberals. Our own military considers climate change to be a national security threat. Why won't Trump listen to his, quote, generals, as he has called them many times now? The Department of Defense has been saying that climate is a security risk for years now. The Pentagon continues to plan for the threat that climate change presents to the United States. And of course, Trump doesn't actually respect the military. We know that because if he did, he wouldn't have picked fights with the widows of deceased soldiers. He wouldn't have picked fights with Gold Star parents. Trump doesn't respect the military, as evidenced by his numerous promises to make donations to veterans' charities, which basically he hasn't done other than the one he was shamed into doing, that $25,000 check to a Gold Star family. So the question really is whether this is pandering or self-interest from Trump in removing climate change from the list of national security threats. On the one hand, there are likely ways that as a real estate developer, you want to be able to do whatever the hell you want, and regulations that sort of account for climate change probably limit your freedom as a real estate developer. But on the other hand, it might just be pandering to that shrinking 30-something% of the country that supports Donald Trump because they're skeptical of climate change, which I call they are divorced from reality on climate change. It might just be a combination of the two for him.
Could just be out of spite, too. I mean, it's not like there's a benchmark or a limit in how many threats you have to list on that document.
That's true.
So he could add economic productivity and border security without having to take away climate change. There's no need for that.
That's the go against Obama at any opportunity argument, right? The idea of going against anything that President Obama did. Of course, it was President Obama, as Pat is alluding to, who added climate change to the list of national security threats. It didn't work out well for Trump going against everything Obama did when he decided to ignore Obama's suggestion not to hire Michael Flynn.
Yes.
That one did not work out particularly well for Donald Trump. We'll see what the impact is of this one, but a big deal and just a really bad thing because it's not zero sum. You can leave national security, you can leave climate change on the list of national security threats and still say that you want a renewed focus on whatever else, economic stuff, border security, whatever it is that you want to put on there. It is probably a combination of incompetence, pandering, selfishness, and spite, as producer Pat is pointing out here as well. So we talked last week about the repeal of net neutrality. Net neutrality has been repealed. The net neutrality, I call them internet freedom regulations that were put in place under President Obama, but the structure for which actually came from FCC Chairman Michael Powell during the Republican George W. Bush administration. We did not have these oppressive left-wing parameters for net neutrality. It was something that was actually developed over the last couple of administrations. That was repealed. We knew this was probably going to happen when Donald Trump initially appointed Ajit Pai, a former Verizon lobbyist, lawyer rather. What's the difference at this point, right? To be chairman of the FCC, not exactly draining the swamp. And we knew that overwhelmingly Americans were in favor of net neutrality. It was the internet service providers and the lobbyists that were really against it. And one of the things that we knew would be allowed if net neutrality were repealed is that internet service providers would be legally allowed to create fast and slow lanes on the internet. They'd be allowed to charge more for better access to certain portals or websites and services. And all along during this debate, internet service providers said, don't worry, we would never do those things. You can trust us. Look at our websites. We have pledges on our websites about what we will and won't do, even if net neutrality were repealed. Comcast, for example, had the following pledges and statements on their corporate website before the repeal of net neutrality started to be talked about. And you can verify what we're putting up on the screen for you by using the Wayback Machine online to look at older versions of web pages. Comcast won't block access to lawful content. Comcast won't throttle back the speed at which content comes to you. Comcast doesn't prioritize, not won't, doesn't prioritize internet traffic or create paid fast lanes, and then a couple of other provisions that are less relevant here. As soon as a repeal of net neutrality started to be discussed early in the Trump administration, all of a sudden, half of those pledges / statements were removed, and it was obvious what it was that Comcast intended to do. The new version of Comcast pledges or quotes on their website say, merely, we do not block, slow down, or discriminate against lawful content. We believe in full transparency in our customer policies. We are for sustainable and legally enforceable net neutrality protections for our customers. You'll notice that from this, and we can keep it up, gone is, we won't throttle back speed at which content comes to you. Gone is, Comcast doesn't prioritize internet traffic or create paid fast lanes. Note the language there to begin with was Comcast does not, rather than Comcast pledges never to. Sure, you didn't do that when it was written in the law that you weren't allowed to. But of course, any reasonable person knows that Comcast and other internet service providers have obviously been planning to bail on the principles of net neutrality as soon as legally possible, which is now. And I actually saw people commenting online, okay, if you don't like Comcast's new policy, use a different internet service provider if you don't like that one. Most people have no choice, right? This is fundamentally a monopolistic market where most people live in places where you don't have a choice. You have one provider. This is going to be a disaster. Major protests are planned, but will that do anything? And I know people get mad at me, Pat, every time I say this version of resistance or that version of resistance won't do anything. David, you're deflating these activist movements. I'm not trying to deflate them, but I also am trying to think pragmatically about what will and won't change this. I believe that this is an issue of voting. That's the way to change this. You've got to vote them out.
Yeah, I mean, some on the right are now giving lip service to protecting net neutrality. We had that interview a few weeks ago with Andrew Torres on the topic.
That's right.
There is a path forward here. It's just not through the FCC.
And it's also not through anybody who will be in the FCC when Donald Trump is president of the United States. So voting is the path forward here. And I actually do get, people can have reasonable disagreements about abortion, right? Like, I don't agree with the anti-choice movement, but I understand, based on what they consider to be important moral and ethical values, how they might come away being against abortion being legal. I get that. When it comes to net neutrality, there's no real reason to be against it unless you've just completely fallen for the talking points of the internet service providers and their lobbyists.
Yeah, and with many of the big issues of the day, like, say, abortion or gay marriage, you may see like a 50-50 split or a 60-40 split among the population. Here it's an 80-20 split. This should not be a contest.
All you've got is the people that are either for personal reasons, right? They might just have a vested interest in getting rid of net neutrality, maybe because of their job or whatever. Those suffering from such significant cognitive dissonance that they just believe whatever Ajit Pai and Comcast say, and I don't know why you would. These are some of the worst ranked companies when it comes to customer satisfaction. Why would you ever take their word for it? Or it's just, your Republican senator or congressman said it, so you're going with it.
Or they don't understand the issue, which
That's
we're seeing
another
as
one,
well.
yeah. Because when you ask people, are you for or against net neutrality? And then you ask them, are you for or against XY provision of net neutrality? Overwhelmingly, the provisions get way higher favorability ratings than net neutrality at large. It's really bad. And I believe that all activism in favor of net neutrality is good, but I think the path forward to really fixing this is voting them out. I'm on Twitter at @DPacman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show. Quick break, back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome back to the show. Today's new member of the day is Osmo Ronkanen. Osmo, thank you so much for being a David Pakman Show member. You can join Osmo at davidpakman.com/membership. You can also get a free 2018 David Pakman Show wall or desk calendar. You can really put it wherever it works for you. You can get one of these for free if you go to davidpakman.com/calendar18. These are flying out of here. The orders are coming in almost faster than we can process them, but not quite that fast. So you can still get yours at davidpakman.com/calendar18. You can get just the calendar or get the calendar for free with a new yearly membership. You can also make a pledge of as little as $1 a month at davidpakman.com. At patreon.com/David Pakman Show. I want to give you an update on something that's happening within or to Robert Mueller. It's becoming abundantly clear that Republicans and Trump are concocting, I guess I'm going to call it an email scandal against Special Prosecutor Robert Mueller, I believe as a pretext to justify his firing, to create a pretext for his dismissal, which is being discussed publicly more and more. Here's how it's working. We learned over the weekend that Robert Mueller and his team obtained what's being called tens of thousands of Donald Trump transition team emails, which is not good for Trump, right? This is the last thing Trump wants Robert Mueller reviewing. And the emails are said to be from about 12 different accounts. One of those accounts contained about 7,000 emails that Mueller has his hands on. It includes Trump's political campaign leadership, his foreign policy team. The subject matter ranges from everything to, including everything under the umbrella of foreign policy, the confirmation process, strategy around press statements, war plans, tax plans. And the Trump team is reportedly asking for the emails back on the basis that they're privileged and that Robert Mueller's team obtained those emails illegally. And this is where the latest strategy to fabricate this scandal against Mueller is coming from. The group Trump for America has levied a complaint arguing that there was no authorization for the GSA, the General Services Administration, to release these emails to Robert Mueller's team. The lawyer to the Trump transition group has written to Republicans in the House and Senate saying that this was an unauthorized email disclosure. More and more Republicans and right-wing media are using this to slam Robert Mueller. One example is that wacky Fox News judge, Jeanine Pirro, who's just the worst. I mean, she and Sarah Huckabee Sanders are really near the bottom here. She says that the FBI is actually now a criminal cabal. Can you imagine? Check this out from over the weekend.
I doubt in American presidential election history that there has been as great a crime or as large a stain on our democracy than that committed by a criminal cabal in our FBI and the Department of Justice who think they know better than we who our president should be.
A criminal cabal within the FBI. So what's the truth about this? Here's Renato Mariotti on Twitter. He's a former federal prosecutor, legal expert, also running for Illinois Attorney General as a Democrat. If Mueller didn't follow the law, a court would suppress the evidence so it couldn't be used. The reason Trump's lawyers are writing letters to Congress instead of Mueller or a court is because their legal arguments have no merit. And that is exactly right. We have a system in place which would not allow this evidence to be used against Trump or whoever if it was obtained illegally, period. You can make that legal claim if you're Trump's lawyers, but they're not doing that. They're instead making a political claim to senators and congressmen and others because they don't really have anything. They have a publicity stunt here, not a real legal challenge. But the problem is that it will work. There is an element of the right that believes everything they hear from Fox News. They believe everything that they hear from people like Donald Trump and Jeanine Pirro. I was, as I mentioned, in rural northern Indiana recently, Pat, and there were actually people there who I didn't participate in this conversation, but I overheard it, saying, you know, it's sad with all this Russia stuff going on. The only people you can trust right now in the media are Fox News. And
Really?
They said it without any hint of irony. That is what they believe, and that's why this will work. They will be demanding for demanding the firing of Robert Mueller before you know it, because this is all they watch.
Yeah, that's really depressing. Fox News, clearly right wing. They're not going to go with the Associated Press.
No.
Or one of these more reliable news agencies.
Reuters,
CNN is out the door.
CNN is fake news, Pat. Come on,
course.
you know by now. Jim Acosta is going to get dressed down at any opportunity. Yeah, so innocent people will say, innocent people in this situation would say, hey, I support the investigation, I'll cooperate, and I look forward to being cleared. When you start creating a pretext to fire the guy running it after saying this is the best possible person to run it, you don't look particularly innocent.
I just think that it's because the Trump administration and these outlets like Fox News have been on the defense for a year now.
Yeah.
And you just get sick of it. I mean, there's a 24-hour news cycle. You have to have something to go on the offense with, right?
And I guess what they're picking is Judge Jeanine. That is a depressing thing, where that's who you choose to go on the offensive with. Let's talk about Michael Flynn and a possible pardon. Donald Trump was asked about the possibility of pardoning indicted, inane, idiotic, irksome, impetuous, and irresponsible former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. And Donald Trump certainly didn't rule it out. He used language that pretty clearly says, yeah, he might pardon Michael Flynn depending on the circumstances. Here's Trump speaking to reporters outside the White House over the weekend.
Ask you about Michael Flynn. Would you consider a pardon for Michael Flynn?
I don't want to talk about pardons for Michael Flynn yet. We'll see what happens. Let's see. I can say this. When you look at what's gone on with the FBI and with the Justice Department, people are very, very angry. Thank you very much.
I don't want to talk about pardons for Flynn yet. We'll see what happens. And of course, the defenders have two positions on this, and they happen to be diametrically opposed defenses. One is, David, you're exaggerating. Trump didn't say he's thinking about pardoning Flynn. He just said he hasn't yet really considered it. That doesn't mean he's actually thinking about it. The other defenders of this are saying, oh yeah, Trump's the president. There's no reason why he shouldn't be able to pardon Michael Flynn. Pardons aren't illegal. The truth is, Trump has clearly signaled that pardons for his friends and cronies are on the table. He pardoned racist Sheriff Joe Arpaio in August, a clear message that Trump sent that, yeah, he'll pardon people. And sometimes when we report on this stuff, we get into the weeds. We miss the forest for the trees. Obviously, Trump would pardon Michael Flynn if he could get away with it. Ty Cobb, the White House special counsel, said Friday, there's no consideration being given to pardoning Michael Flynn at the White House. You know what this is code for? You know what we'll see is code for? It's code for, if Flynn has turned on Trump and is going to be informing Robert Mueller about possible crimes committed by Trump, then no, Trump is not going to pardon him. If Trump ends up unscathed by the investigation and it turns out Michael Flynn doesn't screw Trump royally, then yeah, Trump will probably pardon Michael Flynn.
And I think it's testing the waters, too, because if Trump does eventually pardon Michael Flynn, then the media story, I mean, the whole idea behind this is that he had been thinking about it all along.
Of course.
And it's not a big surprise when it actually happens.
And that's why I believe that this is going to go on for years, more than likely, right? Trump said recently this will end by the end of the year. Yeah, that's in like 10 days. That's not going to happen. I would be shocked if it wraps up during 2018, but let's say it wraps up by the end of 2018. Then you're going to have the trials if not everybody pleads out. Then you'll have potentially pardons if Donald Trump doesn't get taken down. This is going to go on for years, no matter what at this point.
And there's talk about impeaching Trump already. I think that's a little bit premature.
I agree.
But if he does pardon Michael Flynn, I think you have a constitutional crisis on your hands, and probably it's justified to impeach Trump.
That's the question, which is, even though pardons are legal, of course, are there certain pardons that could contribute to an obstruction of justice case? And that, I mean, but that's way above my pay grade, legally speaking, and we'll eventually talk to the actual legal experts about that. Video has surfaced of a Donald Trump judicial nominee for district judge in D.C. It is one of the most cringeworthy and also disturbing confirmation hearing videos that I've ever seen. This guy's name, this guy right here over my shoulder, is Matthew Spencer Peterson. He was nominated to be a judge by Trump, like I said, and his confirmation hearing goes bad quickly. And the cringe factor is so high that I would not let kids watch this. I would not allow kids in the room if you're going to watch this. It starts off really poorly. Senator John Kennedy, who's a Republican, don't be fooled by the last name Kennedy. He asked panel members to raise their hands if they have never tried cases in a courtroom. Only Peterson raises his hand, which brings on a series of follow-ups, each becoming even more awkward. Take a look at this.
Welcome, gentlemen. Congratulations. You can just raise your hand on this one, if you will, to save a little time. Have any of you not tried a case to verdict in a courtroom? Mr. Peterson. Have you ever tried a jury trial?
I have not.
Civil?
No.
Criminal?
No.
Bench?
No.
State or federal court?
I have not.
Okay. Have you ever taken a deposition?
I was involved in taking depositions when I was associate at Wiley Ryan when I first came out of law school.
Yeah, there you go. So already it's going south. But this is one of the best videos I've seen. A few more questions, and it only gets worse for Peterson.
In that range.
Have you ever tried taking a deposition by yourself?
I believe no.
Okay. Have you ever argued a motion in state court?
I have not.
Have you ever argued a motion in federal court?
No.
When's the last time you read the federal rules of civil procedure?
The federal rules of civil procedure, I have, in my current position, I obviously don't need to stay as, invested in those on a day-to-day basis, but I do try to keep up to speed. We do have, at the Federal Election Commission, roughly 70 attorneys who work under our guidance.
Have you ever hard-boiled an egg? No. The hearing goes forward, and then Republican Senator Kennedy from Louisiana asks about some of the basics of evidence rules and some legal doctrines. And there was a debate over whether these were fair questions or really obscure legal stuff. I'll deal with that after we watch the video.
Well, as a trial judge, you're obviously going to have witnesses.
Yes.
Can you tell me what the Dober standard is?
Senator Kennedy, I don't have that readily at my disposal, but I would be happy to take a closer look at that.
Okay.
That is not something that I've had to contend with.
Do you know what a motion in limine is?
Yes, I haven't. Again, my background is not in litigation as when I was replying to Chairman Grassley. I haven't had to, again, do a deep dive, and I understand, and I appreciate this line of questioning. I understand.
Oh, I'm sure you do. That goes on for about 90 seconds, and then Kennedy tries one more time.
I've been a party to during my time.
Yes, sir. I've read your resume. Just for the record, do you know what a motion in limine is?
I would probably not be able to give you a good definition right here at the table.
Do you know what the Younger abstention doctrine is?
Oops.
Any experience
I've
with that?
heard of it, but again,
How about the Pullman abstention doctrine?
I heard
You'll all see that a lot in federal
Yeah,
court.
Bill Pullman he was the president in Independence Day. That was when he went after the aliens with Will Smith, wasn't it? Just utterly destroyed. So first question is, were these fair questions, or is it like saying, can you tell me what the square root of 3,253,000,000 is? Is it of any value or importance that he doesn't know this stuff, or is it basic legal material? Unquestionably, the consensus of legal experts is that this guy should have known this stuff. He responded he hasn't been working in litigation, but a motion in limine, it's just a basic issue of asking judges to decide about evidence that will or won't be permitted at trial. Dober is a basic issue of how judges decide whether specific scientific testimony is reliable enough for the court. The Younger and Pullman doctrines, if he knows the least that most lawyers know who even don't work in these areas, he'd be able to say, well, it relates to federal courts resolving issues, not resolving issues out of deference to state courts. These are really general things. You can be a good lawyer and not know this stuff, but you can't be a credible nominee to be a federal court judge if you don't know this stuff.
And I don't know if I even blame him that much. I more blame the Trump administration for nominating him.
He should not be nominated. That's exactly right. Just look online at the comments from the attorneys and legal scholars. They all say many attorneys don't know this stuff, but they're not sitting there at a confirmation hearing to be appointed for life to positions as federal judges. And the problem, of course, is that lots of Trumpists don't see this as a problem. They see this as, hey, it's a regular guy, which is, of course, laughable. He's a highly paid guy who did campaign finance law at a major DC law firm. But there's a part of this country that sees this and says, that's right, that's Trump putting just average people there. He doesn't know anything.
Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing I know about Trump, he wasn't really qualified to be president,
No.
but he was going to get the best people for the job to work for him, to work in the courts.
That certainly is not happening. And some of those people have already lost their jobs for disaster. Discuss this with us on our subreddit at davidpakman.com/REDBIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
It's great to be joined today by Stephanie Kelton, who's a professor of public policy and economics at Stony Brook University. She also served as chief economist on the U.S. Senate Budget Committee in 2015 and was an economic advisor to the Bernie Sanders 2016 presidential campaign. It's so great to talk to you. We are going to talk about modern monetary theory. Once again, of course, our audience knows that we recently spoke to Pavlina Cherneva about this. We are now really getting to the end of this potentially significant change to the American tax code. And one of the discussions that we had a little bit with Pavlina, and I'd love to expand on with you, is the discussion of the impact on the deficit of this plan. Stated plainly, should that be a consideration when we think about tax priorities?
Well, only to the extent that politically adding to the deficit charges the debate, and you know, there are things that adding to the deficit could do, like, for example, lead to Republicans saying that they've got to make cuts to Medicare or something. Now, these are political considerations, not economic considerations. So with that caveat in mind, I would say that for the most part, the discussions and the objections Democrats are raising to the Trump tax cuts on the grounds that they add to the deficit is really quite beside the point.
Yeah, and in fact, a lot of the discussion around debt and deficit seems to be the pointing out of the hypocrisy of when that is invoked in some sense. I mean, we know that we have some Republican senators who have previously vowed never to vote for any tax plan that increases the deficit by a penny. Bob Corker comes to mind. I think Rand Paul has made similar comments about the deficit. And yet now they seem not to care about that. Democrats, on the other hand, often don't talk about the debt or deficit when they're talking about programs, but now that it's Republicans who want to do it, are talking about it. It's sort of a punching bag political issue in a sense, isn't it?
Definitely. I mean, it's definitely a political football. You're absolutely right. Both sides use this as an expedient way to try to score a quick point against the other team when they're raising objections to whatever agenda it is they're trying to push. Oh, but this is terrible because it's going to add to the deficit. As if this is something that really resonates with voters, that, you know, when you raise concerns about the national debt or deficits, that this is the best, most effective way to get voters riled up and behind you as you oppose a piece of legislation. I really think it's terribly misguided. Voters, for the most part, don't have the slightest idea, A, what the national debt is, what the deficit is, and they really don't care what number ends up showing up on some government ledger somewhere, as long as they're doing okay in their lives. So if the government is doing something that adds to the deficit, but in the end, people feel better off about their own job security. Maybe they see their wages going up. They feel like they're living in a better economy. They really don't care that the government is added to the deficit. It's more about, what is happening in voters' own lived experiences in the economy. That's the kind of thing that matters, right? And if you tell people you're going to lose your health care, that stuff matters. You can get voters. And that's why I think, when Republicans were trying to do the repeal and replace, the opposition was so strong, right? Because, the Congressional Budget Office looked at this. And when they looked at what Republicans wanted to do, actually, it would have, quote, improved the deficit. Deficits would have been smaller as a result of the Republicans throwing millions of people off health care. But the Democrats didn't say, oh, they're doing this and it's going to shrink the size of the deficit. They said they're doing this and it's going to throw millions of people off their health care. And people stood up and said, over my dead body, we're not doing this, right? And that put enough political pressure on Republicans. And in the end, they were unable to do this. So it's not about the deficit. That, I think, is not the way to the hearts and minds of the American people.
One of the reactions that a lot of our audience had after we talked a little bit about this with Pavlina Cherneva was the inflationary aspect. And to take ideally the most top level view of this, even for the economic sort of layperson, I think a lot of us could understand why, if you just start printing money, if you put more dollars in circulation, or whatever term you want to use for this, and you're holding steady the sort of economic output of a country, if you have more of these dollars, each dollar would be worth less. Or, to put it a different way, prices might go up. There would be inflation to account for the fact that each dollar might be worth less. What's the simplest way to explain to someone who is, again, who's an economic layperson, why that would not happen if we were to say, create a job guarantee, universal basic income, pay for universal health care, whatever program we might imagine?
Well, I think that it depends a lot on what the program is. Some of the things that you mentioned, I think we can do without resulting in the kind of inflation problem that you're describing as a possibility. Other programs, I'm not so sure. It depends on the type of program. You mentioned the universal basic income. One of the things that proponents of the UBI often do is say, well, everybody should get a living wage, the equivalent of a living wage. And sometimes they'll throw around a number like $30,000 a year. Just send everybody a check for $30,000 a year so they have a basic income to get by on. Well, if you actually run the numbers, that turns out to be a humongous increase in total spending. So if you're going to add 30 or 40% of GDP to the economy and not do something to offset that, then I think you're going to get a pretty major inflation problem. So it does depend on the kind of program. What you're describing is a problem that arises when, as Milton Friedman, sort of, the Chicago School of Economics, when Friedman described inflation as always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. He said it's too much money chasing too few goods. Okay, if you're doing something in the economy, whether it's a job guarantee program, large-scale infrastructure program, making public colleges and universities tuition free, whatever it is that you're doing, if you're running up against the real constraints in the economy where you don't have the people and the factories and the machines, the capacity, the raw materials for government to take a larger share of what the economy has available and to spend into that economy, if those things aren't available, you're going to end up bidding up prices. But if you're talking about doing things in a very deliberate way, where you're mindful of how many raw materials do we have? Do we have the people? Do we have the capacity? How much additional infrastructure spending could we do in America without creating bottlenecks in the production process, without causing an inflation problem? You always have to be aware of those kinds of considerations.
So after we started talking about MMT, I had a lot of people who emailed me and said, David, you need to ask Stephanie Kelton about cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, and others, because the explanation for why MMT would work is or can be applied to why allegations that Bitcoin or whatever cryptocurrency have no intrinsic value are debunkable. Do you have a strong sense of that? How does MMT and the sort of underlying theory behind it connect to the existence or lack of intrinsic value or inherent value in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, because, well, from our perspective, MMT likes to look at the currency and say, why does this otherwise worthless piece of paper, why does it have value? Why are people willing to give up a portion of their day working and producing in order to get this otherwise worthless thing called a US dollar, right? It's just an intrinsically worthless piece of paper, except that it's not worthless, right? And so the question becomes, why does the US dollar have value? Why are people willing to work and produce in order to get this thing? And MMT has always connected the value of the currency to the fact that we, the people, need the government's money in order to settle obligations to the government, in order to pay taxes and other fees and things to government. So ultimately, the US dollar is backed by taxes. It's backed by the government's ability to make us write contracts and produce and pay taxes in this currency called the US dollar. Bitcoin doesn't have that. It doesn't have anybody standing behind it, enforcing rules and laws and requiring people to make payments with this form of currency. So it's purely voluntary in that respect, right? And
yeah,
so
I mean, I think to play devil's advocate, there would be the counter argument that while you don't have a government behind it, you do have the infrastructure of the blockchain. You've sort of decentralized the authority behind it. And that in a sense, again, I'm playing devil's advocate here, the defenders would say that's more valuable because you don't have any single entity in control of it.
Yeah, it's more valuable to people who want that sort of anonymity. And so, you know, in the early stages, I think a lot of people were very aware that, you know, a lot of the activity that was going on using Bitcoin was the kind of activity that people don't want the government or anybody else to be aware of because it's not legal. And so, yeah,
I mean, on that, I would want to see some data only because I've researched that aspect a little bit. I mean, I think earlier on in Bitcoin, when the Silk Road was shut down, which was this kind of like dark web hub for the sale of everything from, assassination contracts and more commonly drugs, there was a very small change in the amount of Bitcoin being transacted, and that sort of implied that maybe the illegal uses for it were not as big as was being mentioned. But in any case, it's not really our primary conversation here, but point taken.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is that there isn't that anchor with respect to Bitcoin that there is with respect to a currency like the US dollar or the British pound or the yen or a national currency. It just lacks that government backing that maintains the value of the currency. So the value of the US dollar is never going to go to zero as long as you have a government that's able to make and enforce tax laws. The value of Bitcoin could theoretically go to zero. There's nothing to prevent that from happening.
Would your feelings about its viability change if it was more widely accepted, not necessarily by governments, but by people? In other words, if the number of people and the market cap of it continued to increase and it did start to be accepted as a form of payment, would that change your mind on it, or is it based on the fundamentals of its structure that you're feeling this way?
I don't know that I have my mind made up on it in some respects. So I think it's a fascinating thing that we're all getting to watch, you know, what's happening with these cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin in particular. And to the extent that it actually begins to function in the ways that early on, you know, people said it was going to be an important means of exchange. We're not really seeing that. But I think if we do begin to see that happening, it's going to be fascinating to watch. And yeah, I can definitely change my perspective of the usefulness of this cryptocurrency and others like it as we watch this experiment unfold. I just don't have really strong opinions on it one way or another yet.
To circle back more specifically to at least the U.S. government and its relationship to debt deficit and the ideas of modern monetary theory, is there any particular policy, sort of to round out our conversation, that you think that if we could get wholesale sort of buy-in and understanding of the principles of MMT, there was one policy that it would point to our legislators enacting that would most benefit society? Is there something you have in mind?
I think probably the one that I would go to is the federal job guarantee. I mean, this is the kind of cornerstone policy in a sense with the MMT school of thought. The basic idea here is that there's no other economic school of thought that has a solution for the problem of involuntary unemployment. Not a single one. And so the best that you can do in any of the mainstream approaches to economics is to say to the central bank, target the unemployment rate, keep the level of unemployment at just the right level so that we prevent inflation from accelerating above 2% per year. In other words, we're relying on policymakers to maintain a certain amount of unemployment in the system as a guard against inflation. And what MMT does is say that's extraordinarily inefficient. It's very wasteful. There are costs borne not just, in terms of lost output, but a variety of social costs as well, that the economy would function better, that we would have a more prosperous economy if we institutionalized full employment. And the way to do that is through a federally funded but locally administered jobs program. And it would just make the overall economy function better, because what it does is it takes the automatic stabilizers, the features that are already there today, to help cushion the economy as it goes through the inevitable, booms and busts of a business cycle. And it turbocharges the automatic stabilizer, makes them stronger so that when we have a downturn, the unemployment rate recovers more quickly. It's not as lasting. It's not as deep. Look at what happened in the Great Recession, right? It took 9 years to claw back all the jobs that were lost. So I think that's probably, if I have to pick one, that's the policy that I'm most enthusiastic about.
We've been speaking with Stephanie Kelton, professor of public policy and economics at Stony Brook University. I really appreciate you talking to me today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The International Business Times interviewed Republican Senator Bob Corker. Corker admits he hasn't read the final tax bill that's going to be voted on this week in the House and Senate, but he is going to vote for it. He also claims that he had no idea about a last-minute change to the bill that would personally enrich him. So let's take this in two parts. First of all, there's this provision that was added which allows people like Corker to hide real estate holdings, and also it reduces taxes on income that one earns from LLCs that hold real estate. And it just so happens that Corker earned $7 million last year from exactly this type of income. And it also just so happens that Corker changed his vote from no to yes on the bill after that provision was added. But he says he had no idea about that provision being there, being added, and that it didn't factor into his vote. By the way, Donald Trump also lists between $40 and $70 million of the exact same type of income on his financial disclosures, meaning he would also benefit from this little provision that Corker supposedly knew nothing about. That's part one. Part two, big picture, this doesn't apply just to Corker, but Corker admits he hasn't read the bill, that he read a summary. We're talking about more than $1 trillion in changes hanging in the balance here. He had a summary. He never saw the actual text of the bill, but it's great and he supports it. Now, I get it, right? Word by word, these are huge bills. That's what your staff is for to some degree. But to say, I read a 2-page summary from the leadership of the Republican Party, that's not due diligence. That's not responsibility to your constituents. And then, of course, the straight up lying hypocrisy hybrid that's become kind of the calling card of Republicans under the Trump administration. He told NBC News that he wouldn't vote for a bill that adds a penny to the deficit on October 1st of this year, 10 weeks ago. And now he's all of a sudden in favor of a bill that's going to add about $1.5 trillion to the deficit, except he's voting for it. He's voting for it without even having read the bill, and it benefits him hugely. I guess just hearing that there's a provision that enriches you is enough. You don't even have to read the fine print of the bill at that point. And to add to this, Corker is just one of the senators that has received, or not necessarily received, but who had provisions added either because of their involvement or through no involvement of their own that personally benefit them financially. Not even time to cover them all. There's Bob Corker. We'll let you know whether this ultimately passes later this week. Jared Kushner, in charge of negotiating Israeli-Palestinian peace. Try saying that with a straight face. Laughable to begin with, more laughable after Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which is just such a divisive thing to do that removes the U.S. as an even possibly unbiased arbiter in that conflict. So even though the concept of Kushner is a joke, he mostly has avoided that caught on video type of public embarrassment until now, because he's been a behind the scenes guy until a few days ago. He went to the Saban Forum, which is organized by the Center for Middle East Policy. He was interviewed by Haim Saban. Headlines all around about how embarrassing and humiliating Jared Kushner's appearance there was. And I thought to myself, it's probably being exaggerated. It's that clickbait that I keep hearing about on the internet. No, this is a stunning public dressing down of not only Kushner, but the entire idea of this team that Donald Trump has put together to negotiate Israeli-Palestinian peace. I'm guessing maybe Kushner felt safe here. Saban is an Israeli telecom billionaire. Kushner maybe had no reason to think that this would go horribly wrong, but it did. And in this first clip, you'll notice that Kushner is starting to get nervous, very hard swallowing. You'll notice him going into a talking point coma, as I like to call it, spitting up talking points like a baby, eating solid food for the first time, can't quite get it out or down. Here's how Jared Kushner started going wrong here.
That are of grave concern to people. You have Iran and their nuclear ambitions and their expansive regional mischief. You have ISIS, which this administration's done a really great job of beating back and almost defeating at this.
Oh, yeah.
You have the ideology, the extremism, which I think you're now seeing a lot of leaders in the Muslim world try to restore the religion to what it always has been, and to try to eliminate the ability for people to pervert it in the way they have. And then you have the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And I think that if we're going to try and create more stability in the region as a whole, you have to solve this issue. And so the president sees it as something that has to be solved, that he very much wants to be solved.
Yeah.
And it's something that he's personally put a lot of time into trying to see happen.
All right, so Kushner gets to rattle off about a minute of these rosy, delusional talking points, and then Haim Saban just crushes him and points out that, hey, no one involved in this team put together by Trump to negotiate Israeli-Palestinian peace has any qualifications to speak of. They're basically clueless, and it is a stunning takedown. And then Haim Saban points out that there's no one who has a clue even working on this. How are you guys even still allowed to work on this? And you'll hear the crowd start laughing as if the 73-year-old Saban is joking. And Saban makes it clear, no, I'm completely serious here.
I understand that, but to achieve that, the team has in it an entrepreneur, you, a real estate lawyer, a bankruptcy lawyer. I don't know how you've lasted 8 months in this lineup, but that's for another day. And it's impressive that it's still going. There's not a Middle East macher in this group. So, I mean, how do you operate with people who basically, with all due respect, a bunch of Orthodox Jews who have no idea about anything? What are you guys doing?
So I'll definitely say,
seriously, I don't understand this.
So I'll definitely say it's not a conventional team, but
you can say that again.
Yeah, so that's what I said. That's what I said.
Well, say it again.
Okay. It's a perfectly qualified team in the way Haim sees it. So
how is that?
No, I was joking.
Oh, okay.
So we have. So when we were thinking about how to put a team together, the president and I focused on who had the right qualifications, who we both trusted, and we have David Friedman, who's one of the most brilliant bankruptcy lawyers, who is a close friend of mine.
It's a bankrupt situation, so yeah.
Yeah, we've got the best bankruptcy lawyer working on Israeli-Palestinian peace. I think you can actually see Kushner start to sweat here, and it went on. Maybe you can find the entire thing online. Now, if you don't know Israelis, you might actually think that Saban is joking, because there's this thing about Israeli culture where you'll hear escalation in voices, like at the grocery store or at a bank, and you'll think an argument is going on, and it's not. Those are normal interactions. A lot of examples I could tell you from my last trip to Israel. But then on the other side, you'll see something like this, and it seems kind of sarcastic, kind of ribbing, joking, and it's not. This is Haim Saban pointing out that Kushner and everyone on the team is clueless. what an embarrassment to Jared Kushner. I understand now why he's a behind-the-scenes guy.
Yeah, I watched some of this, and my favorite point, the sticking point for me, was when Saban asked Kushner, what's going to make Trump able to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Yeah.
And of course, Kushner responded by saying, well, he won the election, and a lot of people didn't think he could do that.
It's that kind of logic that actually works on a lot of people. So that's actually an interesting point because it's so absurd as a qualification, but people will hear that and they'll say, hey, that's true. That actually is a pretty good argument. It's not an argument.
Even though many of these world leaders also won elections of their own.
Yeah, and we're not going around praising them. What an embarrassment for Jared Kushner. That's all the time I have for today. No voicemail, great bonus show. We'll talk to you tomorrow.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.